Here we are in Brookdale, Manitoba, located northeast of Brandon. And behind me is, of course, a grain elevator. Most people think that's how grain has always been stored here on the prairies. The reality, however, is that there was a technology before grain elevators, and it was called a flat warehouse. The name basically means that it is horizontal as opposed to vertical. Well, when the grain elevator was introduced, the flat warehouses were just far too inefficient, and virtually all of them were replaced. So nowadays, there are no flat warehouses left, except here in Brookdale. I'm Gordon Goldsborough, president of the Manitoba Historical Society, radio and newspaper columnist, and author of books on the neglected, the overlooked, the hidden places from Manitoba's past. Join me in this series as we explore back roads to places that tell great stories about how things used to be and how we've ended up where we are today. This is Abandoned Manitoba. This particular flat warehouse has been fairly extensively modified from its original configuration, because if we had been here when it was first built in 1902, I would have been standing at the base of a ramp. In those days, of course, there weren't any trucks, and farmers would have had a horse-drawn wagon to bring their grain to market. So they would have come up to the edge of the building here, they would have come up the side of a ramp, because as you can see, the building's quite a ways off the ground. They would have come up the ramp with their wagon, and they would have stopped right about here, right next to this big door. And the idea was that the agent that was operating the warehouse would then come out of the door here, and depending on how the grain was being handled, in some cases the farmer would have his grain in cloth bags. And so the guy would have come out, grabbed a bag, and carried it inside. Alternatively, in some cases, they would have had loose grain in their wagon, so they would have come out with a scoop, scooped a load of it, and then carried them inside. And either way, whether it was in bags or it was loose in a scoop, they would have carried it inside and deposited in a bin inside to be stored, awaiting shipment to market. Well, the tracks are gone, but if we had been here in the heyday of the warehouse, we would have been standing on the railway tracks. There would have been two tracks sitting here, and they would have brought a boxcar up alongside right next to the door here, and they would have repeated the whole process of the movement of the grain. So if they had sacks of grain, they would carry them physically into the boxcar. If they had loose grain, they would scoop it up. Again, a very highly labor-intensive process. And that's how they would fill a boxcar. It might take days at that rate to fill an entire boxcar. Once it was filled, they'd close it up and then move the next boxcar into place. So it's the same basic process that happened in the case of a grain elevator. It just was all done by human power and was therefore a lot slower. And that's why the grain elevators basically took over from the flat warehouses very quickly. So by 1917, there were no flat warehouses still in operation anywhere in Manitoba. Well, I'm going to go inside and have a look what is still left from the original flat warehouse. But I'm a little worried because the windows have been long gone. The glass is gone, and therefore birds have been in and out over the last number of decades. There's bound to be a lot of residual poop there, and I'm just a little concerned about the kind of things that are floating in the air. So I'm going to wear a mask, and I'm going to put gloves on just to keep my hands from getting torn up on some of these broken metal panels. So this building is technically not considered a single story. There's actually a second floor above us. It wouldn't have been a full height floor though, so therefore it would have been for smaller items that would have been stored up there. And of course the other reality is you would have had to carry them up the stairs behind me here, so you would have taken just smaller items up there. The grain, however, would have been stored down here. And the idea again is we have one door over here where the grain would have been delivered. The door over there is where we would take it out to load it into boxcars, and then running perpendicular to this sort of central area here, there would be the bins. And essentially all they would have had is probably a low pony wall that would have contained the grain, and they would have just poured it in piles. I mean, or if they had it in sacks, they would have simply stacked the bags in a pile. But that's really all there would be to it. And so therefore, they wouldn't have stored the grain potentially probably more than about maybe the height of your head. And that would limit, of course, the capacity that you could put in the warehouse. Those pony walls, of course, are gone now. Behind us over here is the former offices of the manager. It's basically gone. The walls that used to separate it from the rest of the building are removed. There's just remaining stuff, which is, I guess, a polite way of saying a bunch of junk, that is liberally covered in bird poop. Even now, there's birds flying in the windows, flying around inside here, because they're probably nesting upstairs, and they're not so happy that we're here wandering around. But the building is in remarkably good shape. Oh, wow. So I don't think that this entrance is original to the building. I think it was cut in afterwards. Otherwise, to get supplies up to the second floor here, they would have used some sort of mechanism. Oh, in fact, we can see it up there. Right in the center of the top of the roof, there's a pulley. They would have probably brought a rope down to the main floor, tied it around, maybe a sack of grain even, and then hauled it up through that large opening and then stack it up here. A little bit of extra capacity, I suppose. This rugged old structure will simply not stand the test of time if it stays here in Brookdale. So I'm very happy to be working with the good folks at the Manitoba Agricultural Museum. This outstanding museum near Austin, Manitoba, has one of the largest collections of vintage farm machinery in Canada, and it has an impressive number of historic buildings, including the second oldest grain elevator in the province. We are raising the necessary funds to move the flat warehouse to the museum, where it will be restored and turned into a permanent exhibit on the history of grain storage on the prairies. Three months later, and on a rainy day in October, a mover has been hired to pick up the flat warehouse in Brookdale and move it about 65 kilometers, 40 miles, to its new home on the museum grounds. The height of the building requires us to have workers from Manitoba Hydro raise, and in some cases, cut power lines along the route. With the experienced mover at the wheel of a massive truck, the flat warehouse wended its way along country roads, secondary highways, and even a jaunt along the Trans-Canada Highway, without a hitch. Well, nearly without a hitch. Until it finally came to rest here at its new home, the Manitoba Agricultural Museum. Well, it's been 3 long months, and as you can see, I finally found my razor. It's also exciting to see that the flat warehouse has arrived here at the museum. Now the hard work begins. Because of course, first we have to build it a solid foundation so it will stand for another 100 years. After that, the hard work begins on the restoration. We have to find out what it would have looked like, what sort of colors it may have had. We start replacing the roof. Of course, it's essential that it have a good watertight roof to ensure that the water doesn't get in and cause damage. We have to make sure that the metal panels on the walls are replaced and painted. We go inside, we need to put in partition walls to make it back to the way it would have looked when it was a flat warehouse. We have to create a manager's office. Once that's all done, we hope that by the middle of next year, we'll have a functional flat warehouse again. It's a real relief that it's finally come together. But the hard work is still ahead. And so hopefully by this time next year, we'll be able to rest easy on the knowledge that we have saved Western Canada's last flat warehouse.